Jen Lucas, managing editor of the Knitting Circle, and I am back today with another live event. Today I'm going to show you how to make this amazing cowl. Yes, it's almost summer, but cowl knitting is year-round, and this one I do think is the kind of project that's perfect for knitting as the weather turns warmer here in the Northern Hemisphere, because it's pretty small. This does just fit in your lap. So actually cowl knitting, I do think, makes good summer knitting, even if you're not going to actually be wearing it in the summer in most places. So before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that you can go ahead and download the pattern that goes along with this live event today, and you can do so in the description for the video wherever you're watching, and it will also be dropped in the chat. Because I mentioned the chat, if you have any questions along the way, be sure to drop them there. Also, I love it when people say hello, let me know where they're watching from and maybe how long you've been knitting, what your favorite thing to knit is. Have you ever knit a cowl? Just make sure you're using that chat box. It's there for you so we can chat along the way while I'm showing you all the steps of this cowl. And then one more thing, I want to remind everybody that right now on the Knitting Circle, we're having blogger awards. So you can go and nominate your favorite knitting blog or vlog. So there is a category that also includes YouTube channels. And you can go ahead and use the link that's in the chat to vote for your favorite knitting blog. I'm always looking for new things to read online about knitting, aren't we all? So make sure that you go ahead and check out our Blogger Awards page and nominate your favorite people. We want to see who you guys love in knitting the most. So let's go ahead and get started on making this cowl. So it's called the odds and ends cowl because, as you can see, it's a bunch of different colors. And the reason being is I just used a whole bunch of leftover yarn for this one. So I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera down and we can talk about our materials and everything we need to get started. Okay, so again, here's the cowl. And so the cowl is just knit in the round, and we're going to start with, I actually started down here. We're going to start down here with the garter stitch, and then we're going to do stockinette stitch, seed stitch, and just kind of repeat everything to the end. We're going to hold our yarn doubled, as in 2 strands together, and that's what gives it this nice sort of marled look that I really love and is actually very popular in knitting right now. And so it's really great for leftovers because I just changed colors kind of randomly. In the pattern notes, I tell you exactly how I changed colors in order to get these different stripes. But you can change them however you want. For my particular cowl, I held one throughout. It looks kind of gray here, but it's actually a light blue. And I held that one yarn because I did have a lot of that one for the entire piece. And then these other colors, I just had tiny little balls of yarn and then I just switched. And again, if you wanted to switch colors at the same increments that I did, that's all in the pattern notes. So for this pattern, we're going to need a total of 450 yards of worsted weight yarn. So these are just a whole bunch of different ones that I just pulled out of my bin here. I have a lot of pink. I actually had so much pink that I thought that if I make another one of these, I might just mix the pinks together because I think that that could look really cool. So just grab all of your different worsted weight yarns that you have. I'm also going to talk about in a little bit how to calculate stitches and stitch counts if you have a different weight of yarn. But we're talking about worsted weight here, so you're going to need 450 yards total, and we're going to be holding it doubled. Let's see, we have some people saying hello. We have Deborah from North Carolina and Vita from New Mexico. Hello, I'm so glad that you could join us today. So once you've decided on all your different yarns and you grab your various yarns, and of course you could just grab 2 balls of yarn that are 225 yards each of the worsted weight, and just knit the same color throughout the whole cowl, obviously. But then we're also going to need some knitting needles. So what I have here is a US size 11. which is 8 millimeters, and this is a 24-inch circular. So you're going to want the 24-inch circular here because our cowl, when finished, has a circumference of about 30 inches around. So by having the 24-inch circular, our stitches will be nice and neat on the needle. You could try to use a 32-inch circular as well, but some people might find that your stitches might be spread out a little bit too far. And then in addition to that, it's sort of, the usual suspects that I talk about in every video. You're going to need scissors to trim your yarn ends. We're going to need a tapestry or yarn needle to weave in our ends. I have both, two different kinds here. I have this plastic one, which has a very large eye. So if you do want to weave in your ends with both of the yarns held together, you're going to need one with a wider eye to fit the yarns through, or if you were doing this like in a bulky yarn. But then I did also bring over sort of my regular one that I use when I'm just using regular worsted weight. So I have both. And then you just need really one stitch marker. I like these locking stitch markers, and I have them in two different sizes. Usually I'm using the smaller ones because I'm usually knitting on smaller needles, but here I do have the bigger ones because I have a bigger needle. So we just want to make sure it's going to slide on the needle. And that's really it. So we have a few more people saying hello. We have Linda from Virginia, and I think Roxanne is your name, and that's from Dubuque, Iowa. So welcome to all of you. I'm so glad that you're here. Okay, so let's talk about, math. I have a piece of paper here and a marker. So let's talk about math before we start talking about our casting on, just very briefly, in case you don't want to use the worsted weight yarn. So for this cowl, we need an even number of stitches because the way the seed stitch works in this pattern. I mean, you could put an odd number, but you'd have to do a little bit more thinking, and who wants to think while they're knitting, right? So for this particular pattern, my gauge was 12 stitches and 16 rounds equals 4 inches. So really, we're going to worry more about the stitches per inch rather than the rounds per inch, because the stitches per inch is what's really important here, because that's talking about the circumference. So for our cowl, we're getting a gauge of 3 stitches per 1 inch. And so if we think about the fact that we want our cowl, well, I know it is because I designed the pattern. We want a cowl that has a circumference of 30 inches. All we would do is take 30 inches times 3 stitches per inch, and that's going to give us 90 stitches, and that's what we're casting on here. So if you have another yarn, now let's say you're doing something that you have a sport weight yarn, you want to make this cowl just plain old out of a sport weight yarn. Okay, you would look at your yarn label, and your yarn label would tell you exactly how many stitches per inch you would get. The yarn labels almost always will have a gauge written on them, especially the kind that you would get at a big box craft store. All those will have the gauge information on them. So a sport weight, it depends on the particular sport weight yarn, but usually a sport weight is around 24 stitches for 4 inches. And so that works out then to 6 stitches per 1 inch, right? Because we're just going to take 24 and divide by 6. Or divide by 4. That's pretty easy math. So 24 divided by 4 is 6. So 6 stitches per inch. So now if you still wanted a circumference of 30 inches for the same cowl, we would just do 30 inches times 6 stitches per inch, and that's going to give us 180 stitches. So if you were going to do this pattern and then just do it with just a sport weight yarn, you would need 180 stitches. The point is you need to have an even amount of stitches. So if somehow your math worked out to an odd number of stitches, I would either just go up 1 or down 1 to get it to be an even number. But I just wanted to talk about that because this is one of those types of patterns that I know a lot of people are curious, like, okay, but how do I figure out how to cast on a different amount? So again, like worsted weight, you might be getting more like 4 to 5 stitches per inch. You would take that, multiply it by the circumference of your cowl that you want. So that's like how big around this way it goes, to figure out how many stitches. So again, I know math is not everybody's thing, but I wanted to just talk about that in case you wanted to use a different yarn for your project. So, okay, now that we talked about that, let's talk about casting on. We have some people working on some projects here while I'm showing you how to make this cowl. Karen is currently knitting an easy blanket. I love easy blankets. Lindsay is working on a fluffy blanket using jumbo yarn in size 17 needles. That's awesome. And Marie just started out knitting, or just started out with knitting and just finished a crochet blanket. Well, I love to both knit and crochet, so I'm glad that you're here and I'm glad that you're doing both. So now let's finally get started with our cast on. So we're going to start by holding the yarn double throughout. I just have 2 worsted weight yarns. I have pink and green here, but obviously whatever colors you choose are fine. And I also am going to use just a smaller circular needle, so you don't have to watch me work on 90 stitches. So when I'm going to be working my yarn held double, all I do is I just get it so my tails, just because it drives me crazy if my tails are 2 different lengths. I just make sure my 2 tails are together, and then I'll just hold the yarn together like this. Now, if you have a ball winder, and in particular a jumbo ball winder, you could actually wind your yarns together into a giant ball. I mean, you can do that by hand too, but in general, I just have my 2 separate balls of yarn and just take out of them as I'm going. And so we're going to start with our cast on, and I used a long tail cast on, and I've talked about my trick many times before, but when I'm estimating a cast on, I like to wrap the yarn around. For long tail, I wrap the yarn around the needle 10 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, pull it off and say, okay, that's 10 stitches, fold it over for 20, 30, 40, etc., until I get to the 90 stitches. When I have a lot of stitches to cast on though, I do like to add then a little bit extra into the tail just to make sure that I don't run out. But we're just going to do a few here just to show you how to do the long tail cast on with the yarns held together. And it's really just as simple as treating the 2 yarns held together as a single yarn. So I'm just doing the long tail cast on here, but you can use whatever cast on you like. For this particular cowl, I don't think it really matters which type of cast on you do. I just like the long tail. I like how it looks. So you would just keep casting on until you had your 90 stitches. And you can see here when you're counting, you do have 2 strands of yarn in each stitch, but that just counts as a single stitch. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches. And so I would just keep casting on until I had the number that I needed, which for this cowl is 90. So I have a little bit of, I cheated and I cast on some stitches already. Let's see. Oh, Deborah's saying I'm a self-taught knitter for over 20 years or so. Well, Deborah, I am also a self-taught knitter. I taught myself how to knit out of a book, and it just was about 20 years ago now. So awesome. So once I have the required number of stitches, which again is 90, I'm ready to join in the round. So you'll have something that looks like this on your 24-inch needle, and you'll be ready to join into the round. So what I'm going to do though is I like to make sure that I have a nice neat join when I'm joining in the round. So I've cast on here, I think I put 48 stitches on this tinier needle. Again, you'll have 90, but I'm just going to take my tail and cast on 1 extra. So now what I'm going to do is there's different ways that you can do this as far as joining in the round, but I'm just going to take 1 stitch from the left needle and bring it over to the right, and then I'm going to take that extra stitch that I cast on and pass it over, and basically I just bound off 1 stitch. And now look, I've made this nice, neat little join right here, because sometimes when you're knitting in the round, you end up getting this little gap here, and it tends to go away as you're knitting, but it can be kind of annoying. So I find if I just cast on one extra stitch and then I just sort of bind it off, it makes that join much tighter. Now, of course, I was sure to check that all of my stitches were all facing in the same direction. When I'm doing that, I tend to make sure that my cast on edge is all towards the middle. That's just my personal preference, but basically you want to make sure that that cast on edge isn't at any point doing a half twist over to the other side, because then you're going to get a twist in your knitting, which for a cowl, it's not so bad because you could just keep the twist in and wear it that way. Although you would have the wrong side showing a little bit, you know, because you have that half twist in there. But obviously if you're doing something like a hat or a sock, and you get that twist in there, once you've gone, you know, 2 rows in, you've kind of, well, you've screwed yourself, and so you have to rip it out. So you always want to just double check to make sure that all your stitches are going in the right direction. And then we're going to place a stitch marker on the needle. And so now we're going to just begin with the pattern, and we're starting with garter stitch. So garter stitch, typically you think of garter stitch as, oh, I'm just knitting all the stitches, which yes, when you're knitting flat, you are just knitting all the stitches on both the right side and the wrong side of your project. But keep in mind now we're working in the round. So that's not going to work here, because when you're knitting in the round, you're always on the right side of your work. So to knit the garter stitch, what I'm doing is I'm starting by knitting around. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to purl around. So whenever you are working garter stitch in the round, you knit around and then purl around, knit around, purl around. So that's what we're doing here. You'll notice as I'm knitting, you again have to, just for this whole project, treat these 2 strands of yarn here together as a single stitch. And that's where the mistakes have a tendency to come in on this type of project. And it happens to me all the time too, is that you accidentally split this stitch and you might knit this one and then knit this one. And now I've actually created an extra stitch there, which is not what we want to do. You want to make sure that you are treating that as a single stitch. But this is the kind of project I like to call potato chip knitting, because this really is a beginner friendly or a very easy project, because we are just doing knits and purls here. But this is the one place where the mistakes can happen. And really, it's not that big of a deal until we get to the seed stitch part, where we do need to have an even number of stitches. So, you know, it's one of those things that you don't, if you find the mistake later, you don't necessarily have to fix it if you don't mind the way that little error looks. But you're going to want to make sure that you have that even number of stitches when you get to the seed stitch portion. So as I'm working this, let's just check out some of our other comments. Lindsay has been knitting for about 1.5 years. That's awesome. And Karen has been knitting a little more than 3, maybe 4 years. That's great. I love hearing that people have been with the craft for a long time. And I love hearing about people that are a little bit newer to the craft too. I always love trying new crafts, and I'm really glad that you all have found knitting. So, okay, we're just going to keep going here, almost to the end of this round. And once I get to the end of the round, we have knit this round. So now we're going to be purling. And so as I'm going, I just sort of smooth the yarn out as I go, just so I'm not getting anything where this is like kind of folded over or anything like that. I just kind of smooth it with my hands as I go, just so that it stays in kind of one strand together, if that makes sense. This one would be really great if you do like some of those more novelty yarns or fuzzy yarns. You could carry one of those along with it. That could be very cool. Personally, Angora and stuff like that tends to make me sneeze. So I don't tend to use that a lot. But if you like that kind of yarn, you absolutely should use it. Oh yes, Karen says knitting is my de-stress and relaxation. Yes, that's absolutely true. I love, and a project like this for me really is one of those kind of de-stress, relaxing projects. It's not that many rounds. It's only 53 rounds total. And it's really just garter stitch, stockinette stitch, and seed stitch. And Karen says, I've become more dependent on my knitting since the pandemic. Yes, I feel that too. In addition to knitting, I also crochet and do counted cross stitch. And those are the counted cross stitch, especially, that was my major de-stressing hobby during the last couple of years. So now that we've finished round one, which is knitting all the stitches, I'm going to bring the yarn from the back because we were knitting, and I'm going to go ahead and bring it forward to the front, because now we're going to purl all the stitches. So we're just purling each stitch. Again, we're just making sure that we're treating each stitch as a single stitch. And Donna says, knitting is my art and self-expression, as well as my way to show affection as gifts. And Donna, that is so great. I love, love, love that you use knitting as your art and your self-expression. That's really, really awesome. And I agree on the gifts, that there are people in your life that are knit worthy, and it's really nice to make things for them. Yeah, I love knitting gifts, but I'm sure you all experience it, that not everybody gets a knitted gift, but those people that are truly special in your life, they do get all the knitted things. Although, because I do knit for work, people don't get as many knitted gifts as they used to. So I'm going to just keep continuing purling around here to the end. And so this would be round two. And then for the rest of the garter stitch portion, we are going to just repeat those 2 rounds twice more. So you're doing a total of 6 rounds of garter stitch. You're doing knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl. And so that's your knitting around, purling around, for a total of 6 rounds. And that would take us through the end of the garter stitch portion. And so once you have that garter stitch portion done, then you're just going to start on the stockinette stitch portion. And all we're doing there is stockinette, when worked in the round, is knitting every stitch, because we're always on the right side. So then you get 8 rounds of just plain old knitting, plain just knitting every stitch. Again, that's what makes it such a relaxing and also beginner friendly project, is that we're just doing knits and purls here, and mostly knits, which is my personal favorite. I feel like I could just knit, just do the knit stitch and be happy. I would just knit everything flat and garter stitch, because I love garter stitch so much. Okay, so we're almost at the end of this round. And so you would just keep continuing with your garter stitch and then move into that stockinette stitch portion. So let's say we're going to just now pretend that we finished our garter stitch section. And now we'll slide the marker. I've moved the yarn to the back, and now we would be ready to knit again. Now, what if you want to change colors? Let's talk about it. So at any point, or as I indicated in the pattern, when to change, you can change your colors literally whenever you want. If you have tiny little balls of yarn, like even smaller than this one that I have here, you know, you might have really tiny balls of yarn if you like to save, you know, save all of your leftovers. So you might, you know, have a really scrappy cowl that maybe you only got 1 or 2 rounds out of a yarn. Again, you can change it as much as you want. So let's first talk about if we just want to change one color. So I don't know, what other colors do I have here? I got a white. You know, I'm sticking with the pink. I'm like obsessed with this pink today. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to cut the green, and you're just going to need to leave a tail long enough to weave in the ends at the end. So we have cut the green, so we can set our green aside now. And then I'm just going to pick up my next worsted weight yarn, and I'm going to pick it up, and still we'll keep going with the pink for this next round. Let's see if we can find, do I have a tail coming out of the center? Well, no, but oh wait, yes I do. Okay, here we go. I like to knit from the center of the ball when I can. So all I'm going to do is just drop that green yarn. I'm going to pick up the white, and I'm just leaving a tail of the white hanging down so that I can weave it in later, and then holding the pink and now the white together, I'm just going to start knitting. So now all I've done is I just dropped the green and cut it and started in with the white. And I'm just going to go ahead and knit around, and then we'll talk about if we want to change both. So let's see, Dottie says, I hadn't knit for over 40 years until I moved and joined His Hands, a knitting group at my church in the last 8 years. That's awesome. I know that there's so many groups that do things, especially church groups and things that do a lot of charity knitting, make a lot of prayer shawls and a lot of projects for different people going through hard times. So that's really great. I'm glad that you found your way back to knitting. And Kiara says, this looks so fun and easy. I want my grandma to make me one. Yes, Kiara, I hope that she does. And if you want to learn how to make one, we actually do have a 14-day Learn to Knit series on our Knitting Circle website. And all of everything that I'm doing today in this video will be in that Learn to Knit series. And also you'll be able to watch the replay of this video if you decide to make one for yourself, or you can just send your grandma the link and then she can watch this video and make one for you. This is just a really great fun project for beginners and experienced knitters alike. Okay, so we're coming to the end of this round. Again, this would be now after you did your 6 rows of garter stitch, you would do 8 rows of stockinette stitch, which would be knitting all of the stitches for 8 rounds for stockinette. You knit all the stitches. So let's do one more round of knitting all the stitches, and now let's just change both colors. So if you do want to change both colors at the same time, you know how to do that. Okay, so let's say we want to change both colors, and let's make it even a little bit more, not complicated, but let's think about it a little bit. So let's say we wanted to change now both colors, but we knew we wanted to go back to the pink again later. Maybe you do want to do that, maybe you don't. I don't know, it's your cowl. So what we'll do is I'm just going to go ahead and cut the white. And I'm going to leave the pink, because if we've decided we want to go back to the pink later, why cut it and have another end to weave in when we could just carry it up on the inside? So now let's really see what we got. Let's use this one. And how about we'll go with this light blue one that I used on the other cowl. Okay, and this, so we can get the white one out of the way. And now I would just set my pink one aside because it's still attached to my project, but we know we're going to want to come back to it at some point. And this one I am going to just take it from the outside because I feel like, wait, did I find the center? One of these comes from the center. There we go. Oh my gosh, it's going to be Karen Burf. Okay, there we go. All right, so we have our light blue, and I have sort of my turquoisey green one here. And all we're going to do is the same thing we have been doing. We're just going to hold these two together. Again, I like my tails to be the same length when possible. Okay. And this is a lot of yarn together, but keep in mind, it's just scrappy. So we'll just handle it at the end and weave in all our ends. Okay, so we're going to just leave the pink hanging. And then all we're going to do is start knitting with the new yarn. So what I do is I will take the new yarn and I just kind of fold it like this. So it's just sort of like an upside down U. So that pretty much looks like a stitch, and then you can just stick it right on there and through. And now I'm knitting with the new yarn. And then of course, make sure you're knitting with the actual yarn going to the balls of yarn and not with your yarn tail. And you will see, you will get a little bit of a gap here, but when you go to weave in the ends, that really will just go away. And you can, if you do have a little hole that you don't like, you can use your end to sort of just stitch it closed. On some projects, I actually will use the old yarn and the new yarn together. So I would take the pink and knit it into this stitch, which you can do too, and that also helps close that gap. but not necessary. However you want to do it is fine. But then as I'm knitting around, because I've decided for this little sample, I want to go back to the pink at some point, I'm just going to leave it hanging out there, not being used while I am knitting my next round. And again, however you want to change the colors is great. And I think that if you had, if you didn't want to do all this business with changing colors and you wanted the colors to change, one thing that could be really fun is using one solid worsted weight yarn and then taking a either a gradient yarn that's in worsted weight or a self-striping yarn that's in worsted weight and hold it together with that more solid yarn. And then you're getting the color changes without having to actually keep cutting your yarn, which could be nice. Or you could even take a variegated yarn. It would be more speckly almost. I actually knit a bunch of hats like that, holding the yarn together. Just with my sock yarn leftovers, I started knitting a bunch of hats, holding them together, and they just looked really, really cool and speckly. So there's lots of ways that you can work color into this cowl without necessarily, you know, changing the colors every few rows, but I did change the colors every few rows. So I wanted to make sure that I was showing you that here. All right, so we're coming to the end of this round and we'll just keep going with this color. But if I was going to be carrying the pink up a few more rounds, I keep saying rows, I think, but it's rounds. We're working in the round. What I do is then I would bring my working yarn down, bring that yarn I want to carry up, and then I just bring it up and over and through like that. So now when I go to make the next stitch, the yarn I'm carrying up has crossed over. And so that will carry it up as I'm working. And now you don't necessarily have to do that every single round. You can, you know, do it every 2 or 3 rounds. You just don't want to go so far that it really tightens up your cowl. You want to make sure that you're keeping this pretty loose. And then you would just keep working your pattern. And I'm just giving my little tails a little bit of a tug here, not too tight, just to sort of tighten everything up at this juncture here. So you would work your 8 rounds of stockinette, which is just knitting every round. And then we're going to start the seed stitch. Now for the seed stitch, it's a 2-round pattern. And so we're going to knit 1, which I already did, and then bring the yarn to the front and purl. So our first round of the seed stitch is just knit 1, purl 1 all the way around. And so I'm just going to keep doing that. For those of you that are joining us a little bit late, I just want to remind everybody that we do have this pattern for the odds and ends cowl available for you to download. So you can knit one for yourself later, and you will find that link in the description for the video and also in the chat box. And we also were talking about at the beginning of the video that right now the Knitting Circle is running their Blogger Awards contest. And so there's a link to that in the chat as well. So be sure to check it out, because right now we're in the nominating phase of the Blogger Awards. So there's a few different categories for regular blogs, and there's also categories for vlogs or YouTube channels. So be sure to check that out and nominate your favorite vlogger or blogger for our Blogger Awards. So as I'm working this seed stitch, I just want to make sure that I'm bringing the yarn in between the needles as I'm switching between the knit and the purl, because if you accidentally bring it over the needle, you're going to make an extra stitch, and that's not what we want. We just would like our nice perfect stitch count that is an even number. Hopefully I have an even number on this little swatch. And if I don't, you'll see how I would fix that. So if you did end up having an odd number of stitches and you're coming to the end, the round should end, the first round of your seed stitch needs to end with a purl 1. So I would first go back and check to make sure that I didn't accidentally knit 2 or purl 2, because that would screw up the look of the seed stitch, obviously. But if I just had like an extra stitch or something and I hadn't dropped one, or I just picked one up along the way because I knit the stitch, you know, I knit the 1 stitch as 2 stitches, I would just knit 2 together or purl 2 together, whatever, at the end to get my stitch count back to the right number. I'm somebody that I will always fudge it a little bit if it's not like an obvious mistake. But that's just my personal preference. I know some people like to go back and fix their errors. So I got 3 stitches left, so this is going to work out right. So we get knit, purl, and end with the purl. So that takes care of our first round of seed stitch. And so we did knit 1, purl 1 all the way around. So for our next round of the seed stitch, now we're going to purl 1, knit 1 all the way around. And so it's the same thing. We're just starting with the purl 1 instead of the knit 1. And that creates that texture. One thing I really love about knitting cowls, especially, is that they don't have to really fit, that there is some planning as far as the circumference of it. It needs to be big enough, obviously, to go over your head and around your neck. So typically I will make these about the minimum I will make them is a 24-inch circumference around, because that's enough to get it over your head and be a close to neck cowl. But I know that a lot of people don't like like having, you know, they're knitting right up close to their neck like that. It makes them too hot. So something like this where we've done a 30-inch circumference can be nice because it gives a little bit more drape and it won't be so close to your neck and maybe not quite so hot. But you can make your cowl any circumference that you want, really. But again, I just tend to stick with 24 inches tends to be my minimum. Okay, so we're just going to keep working around. And one thing, when you're doing the seed stitch, yes, we're starting, we know that the first round, which would be round 15, is knit 1, purl 1. And then the second round, which is round 16, is purl 1, knit 1. And then we're going to repeat those 2 rounds. And then we're going to repeat round 15 one more time. So we're going to have a total of 9 rounds of the seed stitch. But you don't even have to, because at some point you're going to probably have to set your knitting down. Most likely you're not going to knit this whole thing in one sitting. But let's talk about how to read our seed stitch. So we already had done our first round of the seed stitch, and see how our next stitch here, and it's a little bit hard to see because we are holding the yarn doubled, but we do have that purl or garter stitch bump, which means that we had purled there and we're in the round. So that looks like a purl. So now we're going to knit it. And then our next one looks like a knit because we have that flat V there. So we know that we need to purl it. So what tends to happen when people have their seed stitch go awry and things don't look right, it starts looking like ribbing. It's because this is a knit and then they knit this stitch and then this looks like a purl and they purl it. So with seed stitch, you want to make sure you're doing the opposite. So this looks like a knit below it. So we're going to purl. This looks like a purl. So we're going to knit. So once you get established with that first round, you really don't even need to really look at the pattern until you have your 9 rounds of your seed stitch done. And so here we are coming to the end. And then maybe we'll cut one of these and rejoin the pink, and we can talk about how the bind off is going to work. So you would just keep working this pattern as it's written. So after you do your seed stitch, you're going to go back to the stockinette stitch. Actually, let me bring the actual cowl in. So we started with garter stitch here. That was a total of 6 rounds. Then we did our stockinette stitch. That was 8 rounds. We do 9 rounds of seed stitch, go back to 8 rounds of stockinette, another 9 rounds of seed stitch, 8 rounds of stockinette, and then we're going to finish it off with the garter stitch. And the garter stitch here, I actually did 5 rounds and then bound off just so it would, in my opinion, more closely match the cast on. So you would just follow the pattern for each round, but it is a total of 53 rounds. So let's just finish this off, but then we'll just talk about how to bind off at this point and little tricks on binding off your project. So once you've finished round 53 is just going to be all pearls. But I'm just going to bind off here just to show you. So we can take our marker and let's cut one of these. So we'll pick that pink back up. Let's cut this blue one, this light blue one. Okay. So now we're going to bind off. So we're going to bind off just how we normally would. This the pattern says to bind off knitwise. So I'm going to go ahead and pick up that pink because that's what I've decided I'm going to use for my bind off, and then my turquoise sea blue. And okay, to bind off, we're going to knit one, knit the next one, pass the first over the second. And that's a knitwise bind off, and it's called a knitwise bind off because we are knitting the stitches and then binding them off. And again, this will be bumped up against a round of purl stitches. Here I just had the seed stitch on my little swatch. And so we will just keep binding off. So I'm just going to keep going all the way around until I have all of my stitches bound off. And again, just like the whole rest of this pattern, I'm just treating every stitch, even though the yarn is held double, I am just treating them as a single stitch. One question I do have for everybody is, do you have a lot of yarn leftovers? Do you save your leftovers? Do you make them into other things? Do you donate them? Do you throw them out? There's no right answer. Everybody, has different ways they enjoy their hobby, and one is not better than the other, but I'm just curious about what everybody does with their leftovers. I am somebody who tends to keep them, but I do like to make a lot of scrappy things. Like I said, I like to make hats with my leftover fingering weight yarn. I'm working on a crocheted blanket with my sock yarn leftovers, where I'm making crocheted granny hexagons. So there's so many different things that you can do with your leftovers. But if you don't use your leftovers, that's okay too. Let's see. Shasa says, I'm brand new to knitting, but want to learn. Well, I'm happy to tell you, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that we have a free 14-day Learn to Knit series. And that will show you all the basics from casting on to binding off. And it comes with a free pattern. It's another cowl. It's a slightly different one. It has buttons on it actually. But if you go and watch through those videos, you will learn every single technique that I'm using here in this video. And then of course you can always come back and watch this one again. And I actually think that this is a very good first project. I never recommend people knitting a scarf as their first project, because you're gonna get the basics of your knitting down after about 12 inches of that scarf. And then you're still gonna have at least 4 feet of scarf to knit, and you're going to be bored, and then you're going to say knitting is boring and you're never going to knit again. That's what happened with my sister. Anyway, so something like this with a cowl, I mean, the hardest part is knitting in the round, and that's really not that hard, but all these stitches are very, very beginner friendly. I think this would actually make a really great first stitch pattern, or a really good first project. Let's see. Donna says, I save all my scraps and make what I call signature cowls to use them up, lay them out to find a good color combination, and also beanies with stripes. That's really great. And Deborah keeps them and uses them for items like entrelac, 10-stitch blankets, etc. Yes, that's really, really great, especially with some of these worsted weight yarns. Like this particular ball of yarn, this is the Red Heart Super Saver. It comes in a really big ball. And so I tend to end up having leftovers of this type of that, like 100% acrylic yarn that comes in those really big balls. I have a tendency to have lots of those left over. So those are great ideas. Signature, I like that. I like signature cowls because they truly are one of a kind. And that's the great thing about this odds and ends cowl, is it's truly one of a kind if you're using your leftovers. And you're able to enjoy some of that yarn that you know, you get to enjoy some of the yarn that you loved again, which who doesn't love that? Okay, I'm having a little issue here where I'm just splitting the yarn. So we're just gonna take it back out. Here we go. Let's try again. Yeah, you just want to make sure with this, sometimes I have a tendency to drop just one of the yarns and not both. So you just want to watch out for that too. But fortunately, when you're holding two yarns together, it does have a tendency to hide your mistakes. So again, why this is a great beginner project, because with that marled effect we're getting with the yarn, it really hides many of your mistakes, which is always a good thing in my opinion. Okay, so I'm coming to the end of my binding off and I just have a few stitches left. And when I'm just doing regular bind offs like I'm doing here, I like to bind off until I have 2 stitches left. And I've talked about this on many lives before, but you're going to see me do this on many lives going forward because it's a great little hack here. So when I get to the last 2 stitches, I knit them together. And this really more on pieces worked flat in rows. This matters, but this helps from having a weird big loopy stitch at the end. Let's see, Jean uses scraps for toys and hats, scarves, cowls. Mixing it up is another way to be creative and design your own. Exactly. I love that everybody's got such great ideas for their leftover yarn. And hopefully that means you want to make this cowl too. Okay, so we're just going to tighten up just our little ends here. Okay, so I knit those last 2 stitches together and then just pass the first one over. And now we're done. We just have our 1 stitch left. We're going to cut both yarns. I'm going to leave a little bit of a longer tail here because I want to talk about how to deal with this end. So for this, I'm just going, it's a little tight. I'm just going to pull it right through like this. Okay, now I have this weird little circle of knitting, but obviously you would have something that looks like this. So when you get to the end here, you can see, hopefully you can see, let's see, we'll pull this down. Oh yes, Dawn says, I have a knitted scarf project in the car. It's been in progress for a couple of years, LOLs. That is so true. I taught one of my nieces to knit and it didn't really stick. I'm hoping that I can try again with her in a couple more years. And she's like, I want to make a scarf for my mom. I'm like, great. And then I show her, and then like pretty soon the scarf for her mom turned into a scarf for herself, which turned into a blanket for her dog, which turned into a blanket for her Barbie, because it was just that she was getting so bored. And yeah, that's so true. Yeah, the scarves. And I'm somebody that I could knit for hours and hours and hours at a time. But there's something about just knitting back and forth on a scarf. I do find it incredibly boring, which is why you don't see a lot of scarf patterns in these Facebook Lives. But maybe I'll do one where it's knit on the bias, because that is something I do enjoy doing and takes the sting out of just knitting back and forth in rows. So maybe we'll do that for a future Facebook Live. Anyway, after I have bound off, when you're working in the round, you have a tendency to have this sort of stair step thing here. And that's because when you're knitting in the round, you're actually knitting in a spiral, because as you're going, you're just going like around and then up over the next, like the last round of stitches. So you're knitting in a spiral. So what happens is you come to the end and you would just keep going on these stitches. And so you tend to have the stair step, not always. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the fatter, or larger eye, I should say, yarn needle and put both strands on. And I do this on any project knit in the round, not just one where the yarn's held double. I basically am going to make almost another stitch, or what looks like another stitch, with my tail to sort of bridge this gap. And so I'm just going to have my yarn on the needle. Let's bring it up. Okay, I'm just going to go under one of these first stitches here. So I think that this right here, it's a little harder to see when you have the yarns held double. So I'm just went under both bars of the stitch and I'm giving it a tug. And look, even already that looks better. I'm just going to give it a tug. You have to make sure you're tugging on both yarns. And then I'm going to go under both bars, making sure I'm going under hopefully all of the yarns, because they're held double, and go under like this. So see how I almost am making another V of a stitch because I went up and then under and then through. And then if we're just going to give all of this a little bit of a tug, and again, this is a little more tricky because we have the yarns all doubled, but not too bad. But look at how much better that looks already. Just taking that little pass with our tail. And so I do this on any project where I've worked in the round and I'm ending off. So if I'm doing toe up socks, if I have knit like a sweater sleeve, you know, sort of from the, you know, shoulder down to the cuff, and I was finishing the cuff here and it was worked in the round, I would do this because it really just evens it out. We had that huge stair step before, and now it's basically even. And actually, once we went and weave in all our ends, it would look even better. And then I would just take this because I was on the right side. I would just poke this through to the wrong side. And then I would go ahead and weave in my ends. And so for weaving in your ends, it's kind of up to you how you want to do it. You could leave both on your yarn needle and weave them in. You might find that that is a little bit bulky for your cowl. Again, it's kind of up to you what you want to do. But this is going to add quite a bit of bulk, but this is also adding bulk to the inside of your cowl. So maybe you don't care. And especially if you did switch your colors quite a few times and you have a lot of ends to weave in, you might just decide you don't care and you're just going to weave them in with them held together, and that's totally fine. It's just, this is like many things in knitting, it is just a personal preference thing. But if you did want to separate each individual tail, you could do that too. And as I'm weaving in my tails, I am taking a look at it from the front. So you can see we did have this like little gap here from where we had changed colors. So I might take, let's just take one of these tails. Normally I would just work from the top down with my tails. But let's just take one of these. I like to fold the yarn over the eye of the needle and then smush it through. This needle, yeah, there we go. So here where I had the hole, I might first just do a little back and forth action just to close that gap up. Here we go. You can see from the front, that looks a lot better too. And so I would just keep weaving in those ends until I was done. And now you have a cowl that is complete. Well, I have this little loop of yarn that's complete, but you'll have this finished cowl. And so maybe you want to block it, maybe you don't, I don't know. It depends on the yarn you're using. For something like this, I have a tendency with cowls just to give them usually just a steam block. I will fully wet block them if they were in my bag for a long time and they were kind of like dirty because I like had them out at a million places. But a lot of times I'll just take my iron I never press my iron onto my knitting because it'll flatten the stitches, but I'll put my iron on the steam setting. And here, these are wool and acrylic yarns. So I just steam it, and that helps even everything out. One thing you want to keep in mind, like I said, don't touch your iron to your project, but especially something like acrylic is plastic. So if you accidentally touch your iron to it, you are going to melt your yarn, which is not good. But I just like to give it a little steam with my iron and then just sort of flatten it out. And that's that. And then it's all ready to wear. And so that is it. Let's flip the camera back up here and just take one last look at our cowl. So here we go. So again, here you go. See, odds and ends. You can switch the colors up however you want. I used a size 11 needle to hold the worsted weight yarn doubled. But if you had a bulky or a super bulky weight yarn that would call for a size 11 needle, you could just do this holding a single yarn together. So there's lots of options with this one, but I really love taking that worsted weight yarn and holding it together to give it that marled look. I just think it's so pretty. You can do it in your favorite colors and your friend or family member's favorite colors. And this really does not take that long to knit because it is only 90 stitches. I mean, that's still kind of a lot of stitches, but for a cowl this size to hold the worsted weight yarn, together, does just make it go a lot faster. Let's see. Oh, Shasta says, can we see the cowl on? Yes, you can. Oh, now I'm admitting I didn't weave in all the ends yet, but there you go. So this is, again, the circumference is 30 inches. Here, let me just take my microphone off. Just so it's not, there we go. So you can see this one's like, for me, it's perfect because when they're too close up on my neck like this, first of all, wool tends to make me a little bit itchy and also hot. And so I like this. So I live in the Chicagoland area in Illinois. So it obviously gets very cold in the winter. So this is for me, this is the perfect circumference to have a little bit of space here. So it's not like so close to my neck, but I can tuck it in to my coat. You could even, if you want, you could even, you know, pull it up like this, almost like a hood situation. So yeah, this cowl I think is perfect, especially if you do live in a cold weather climate for, you know, wearing in the winter. And like I said, even though now in the Northern Hemisphere, we're getting into summertime, I still think that these are great projects to make during the summer because they're small. You know, in the summer, that's not when I'm making my gigantic, you know, my gigantic sweaters or my Afghans or anything like that. I knit a lot of socks in the summer because they're small. So for me, this really is a great project to make in the summertime. So thank you so much for joining me. Oh, Dawn says so pretty. Thank you so much. I'm glad you like it. If you do make this project, we absolutely want to see it. So there's a few different ways that you can show us your works in progress or your finished product. So we do have a Facebook group for the Knitting Circle and for Craftsy as well, specifically for knitting. So you can join those groups and share what you're working on, whether it's something you learned in a live or not. We love to talk about knitting in those groups, but you can absolutely share your progress. In addition to that, on the Knitting Circle website, we have a project gallery, and I love the project gallery because it allows you as knitters to upload what you're working on and share it with everybody else. And we do occasionally feature some of those projects on our live videos or on our social media. And then if you are on other social media, such as Instagram or even TikTok, we are on those. So you can hit us up on those and tag us in your photos and your videos because we love to see what you're working on. So thank you everybody for joining me today. I really hope that you like making this project. This is one of my favorite projects that I've done for these live events so far. So I really hope that you love it as much as I do. Happy knitting, and I'll see you next time. Bye.